I think there's something else going on here, right? I mean, can you talk about the role of military contractors, the war profiteering? Seems like there's a lot of that going on here, especially given everything you've said about this failed strategy. This isn't a strategy to, you know, get things done, get a settlement, bring about some kind of change on the ground. It seems like it's about keeping a permanent state of conflict there. So, could you talk about the role of war profiteering?
Yeah, war profiteering obviously is a big factor in this. It's always going to be a factor in any conflict that the West wages. The ultimate irony is these gigantic military contractors, these weapon manufacturers, uh, because profit is what drives them. There is no purpose except for profit. That ultimately ends up working against them. So they're fleecing their respective countries. All of these Western arms manufacturers, their customers are being fleeced. They get these overpriced systems that may or may not work as advertised. Uh, they may be comparable to Russian or Chinese weapons. They may be inferior to them, as we're seeing play out in Ukraine. Again, the whole thing is they're doing this to maximize profit. They're not doing this to create the best defensive systems possible for the amount of money that they're getting. This is why Russia and China's system for arms procurement, I would say, works much better and demonstrably so. But there's another thing too we have to think about. U.S. foreign policy stretches over decades. It doesn't matter who the president is. If you read documents from the end of World War II, what their vision was for the world, it was to stamp out any peer or near peer competitor. And obviously the two biggest were China and at that time the Soviet Union, but now the Russian Federation. And everything that the US has done has been in pursuit of encircling and containing both of them. It's the same process. They make it look like Russia and China are two separate issues. They're not. They're linked directly together. Over the decades, though, there's this window of opportunity that the U.S. had to assert itself, to establish global hegemony. The window is closing now, especially after the Cold War ended. The U.S. thought they had this big opportunity to knock out all the client states of the Soviet Union. That's what they considered them, the Soviet Union sphere of influence, and also encircle and contain China before it rose. And as we can see, they ran out of time. They're behind schedule on many things. The whole Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Iran. They're supposed to go into Iran. They're behind schedule on all of this. And the reason why is because when they drew up these plans at the end of World War II, they're thinking in 3 dimensions. They're not thinking in 4 dimensions. When it comes to technology, over time, technology improves exponentially, and it helps level the playing field. The U.S. assumed then, while making this plan, that they would have this edge indefinitely, that they would enjoy technological superiority over the rest of the world indefinitely. If you think about it, it's not unreasonable, because for generations, Western imperialism operated on this premise. But that changed, and you can see how Russia and China are leveraging technology to level the playing field and actually rise above it. And the whole concept of multipolarism is understanding that you're not going to be a hegemon, that just create a balance of power globally. The U.S. is fighting desperately against this, even though it makes absolutely no sense.
Right, you can't avoid power. I mean, every country, movement, any time we're trying to influence politics, just anywhere, whether it's internationally or domestically, it involves power. You can't avoid that, but it doesn't have to be hegemony, and that's what multipolarity is all about. It can be we're distributing it amongst ourselves, we're working together, and we're coexisting in a way that can lead to a resolution of conflicts that are going to exist, and they're going to exist for probably quite some time, especially when you have, exactly as you stated, you have the United States and its so-called allies, NATO, etc., waging a kind of this two-front war with Russia in China. And you've been very consistent in covering both of these developments, the encirclement of Russia and the encirclement of China. And one thing that's quite clear is that there is a deficit in attention to one or the other. So oftentimes people will, especially people out here in the West, they'll focus on Russia and not China, or they'll defend Russia and they'll want to defend. There's a lot of splits that have occurred because of this, because and in some part of this is falling into the propaganda. So what are we told? Because it's not a secret about Russia, right? You had Lloyd Austin say that the purpose of what the United States is doing in Ukraine is to weaken Russia. Then you had Joe Biden doing what Joe Biden does and says Putin cannot remain in power. So we know that the United States, even if it's subconscious, even if they don't want to say it out loud, many U.S. officials are looking at Ukraine as one part of a broader war to bring down the Russian government. And with China, it's similar, but even more delicate. Uh, could you talk about like the why? Like, is it purely technology, or is there, because it seems like this move toward war with both of these countries is leading to very bad things for the United States and the West. It hasn't led to prosperity, it hasn't led to even more of a sense of superiority in reality, right? There's not, as you said, in those other wars, they were behind schedule. They weren't doing too hot against smaller countries like Syria, and now they're looking at Russia and China. So how come they can't stop this? Because we're going to get into Pelosi right after this. Because it seems like there's a really difficult challenge ahead of the warmongering psyche of the United States and its allies, where they can't seem to arrest this urge to wage this two-front war.
If you think about the whole system, the Western system, economically, perpetual growth, perpetual increasing profits, it's unsustainable. And so is the idea of empire. It's unsustainable. We've seen all throughout history empires rise and then fall. They overstretch themselves. They expend themselves into extinction, essentially. And this is what happened to the British Empire. And then the United States came in and they took over after all of these European empires. The Vietnam War, that was the U.S., but the West in general trying to reassert themselves in Indochina. They took over these conflicts that the British made. The British were kicked out of their colonies in Southeast Asia. The U.S. took over by backing, and with British assistance. The British still do this hand in hand with the U.S., backing these opposition groups, these ethnic armed groups in places like Myanmar, and they were doing it in Indonesia and Malaysia. They continued doing this with the hope that they could reassert Western hegemony over all of these areas. When you're talking about these institutions, the State Department, the National Endowment for Democracy, all of the money involved, the military-industrial complex, it gets a momentum all in of itself. In other words, they have this momentum. It's very hard to change direction. You just have way too many people with the wrong mentality pursuing hegemony to change it toward a course that's more sensible. And then you see what the result is. You have a bunch of people. It's just like a company that's about to go out of business. It's behind the times. It's overextended. They're way too deep in it, and they were only pursuing profit. They never thought about sustainability, and then they go out of business. They could be the most, like I don't know how many people in the audience are American. I'm an American. I grew up in America. You had things like Sears and Kmart, and they were so big. These companies were everywhere, and now they're nowhere because they couldn't change with the times. And they couldn't change with the times because they had a momentum in and of themselves. And this is the same thing that's going on with Western imperialism. I honestly believe that.